Today we begin with the novel's crucial opening move. Manzoni introduces a seemingly minor local conflict, an interrupted wedding, in order to expose how power actually functions in a small community. Don Abbondio's walk on a familiar road becomes, almost instantly, a demonstration of coercion. Violence doesn't need to be enacted to be effective. It only needs to be credibly threatened. Don Abbondio's response is pedagogical for Manzoni's moral universe. He rationalizes fear as prudence, which allows him to treat cowardice as common sense. In other words, Manzoni depicts not only overt wrongdoing but the social mechanisms that normalize it, especially when institutions, like the church at the village level, are administered by weak individuals. Renzo, Lucia, and Agnes then represent three distinct strategies available to ordinary people under pressure. Renzo responds with action and indignation, Lucia with restraint and faith, and Agnes with tactical realism. Their domestic space becomes a laboratory for the novel's central question: what does moral agency look like when formal authority has been captured by local power? Fra Cristoforo's intervention clarifies a second major axis of the book: the confrontation between ethical conviction and entrenched privilege. When he addresses Don Rodrigo, the scene functions less as a personal dispute than as a study of asymmetry. Virtue can speak, but power can simply refuse to listen, and can outsource its violence to others. At this point, the protagonists attempt what we might call an improvised legal solution. They try to exploit the formal requirements of marriage against the priest's resistance. Manzoni is careful here. The scheme fails not because law is meaningless, but because law without protection is fragile. Procedure cannot survive intimidation. The flight across Lake Como marks the transition from local oppression to broader historical forces. Manzoni repeatedly uses departures, roads, boats, borders, not merely as plot devices but as thematic thresholds. The lovers are displaced into a larger world where the same dynamics recur at higher intensity. Renzo's arrival in Milan brings us into a socio-economic register: bread shortages and public unrest. Manzoni stages the crowd not as a romantic people's uprising, but as a complex phenomenon, fueled by desperation, rumor, manipulation, and the self-propelling logic of collective emotion. Renzo's near-arrest underscores how quickly individuals become legible to the state once they enter urban systems. In the village, power is personal and feudal. In Milan, power becomes administrative and procedural. Renzo is not targeted because he is uniquely guilty, but because the system needs categories and suspects to manage disorder. The border crossing, in lecture terms, dramatizes a change in social identity. Renzo becomes a fugitive and experiences the psychological cost of survival. Safety is purchased by separation, silence, and the loss of ordinary belonging. The novel continually asks what it means to be innocent when institutions presume guilt. Lucia's refuge at Monza introduces a parallel theme: the instability of sanctuary. The convent appears, formally, as protected space, but Manzoni presents it as another institution shaped by human weakness and hidden coercions. Gertrude embodies this contradiction: outward authority combined with inward constraint. Don Rodrigo's plot escalates from petty tyranny into organized predation. Manzoni is interested in how wrongdoing professionalizes, how violence becomes coordinated through networks, incentives, and intermediaries. Don Rodrigo does not need to be present; his will travels through agents. The kidnapping is narrated as a procedural event, efficient, impersonal, and therefore more frightening. Lucia is reduced, momentarily, from person to objective transport. Notice what Manzoni achieves: he makes the reader feel how quickly a social order can reclassify a human being. The Innominato's castle is less a location than a symbol. It represents a world where fear has been institutionalized. Lucia's prayer here is not merely pious. It is a rhetorical act that introduces a moral vocabulary the Innominato has excluded from his life. She speaks a language of accountability into a space built to deny accountability. The Innominato's insomnia is Manzoni's case study in conscience as a psychological event. Importantly, this is not sentimentalized. The crisis is portrayed as a collision between a lifetime of practiced violence and the sudden recognition of interior judgment, what he cannot silence with force. The meeting with Cardinal Federigo Borromeo functions as the novel's central conversion scene, but it is also a meditation on authority. The cardinal's power is not coercive, it is interpretive and moral. He represents an alternative model of institutional presence, one grounded in recognition, responsibility, and the possibility of change. Lucia's vow is a key example of Manzoni's ethical realism. It shows how trauma produces binding decisions that are not purely rational. Her promise is simultaneously an act of devotion and an act of fear management, a bargain with the universe made under duress. As the narrative widens, famine and war are not treated as background texture, they are causal forces shaping behavior. Manzoni insists that private drama cannot be separated from material conditions. Scarcity changes ethics, people become harsher, institutions become more defensive, and the weak become more exposed. The plague sequence is the novel's historical and philosophical climax. Disease becomes the leveling power that undermines social hierarchies, yet it also generates scapegoating and collective paranoia. Manzoni depicts how catastrophe can intensify irrationality even as it reveals the fragility of human control. Don Rodrigo's illness is narratively significant because it demystifies him. The tyrant is reduced to a body subject to the same vulnerabilities as his victims. In Manzoni's moral architecture, this is not simple revenge, it is a demonstration that certain forms of power are, in fact, superficial. Renzo's return to Milan and his entry into the lazaretto shifts the novel into a register of witness. The space is organized suffering, a system trying to manage overwhelming human need. It is also where Manzoni stages a renewed encounter between Renzo and Fra Cristoforo, now placed in the center of the crisis rather than at its margins. Fra Cristoforo's counsel on forgiveness should be understood as practical ethics, not abstract preaching. Manzoni treats resentment as a secondary contagion, an infection of the will that can persist even when the original offender has already been neutralized by circumstance. The reunion of Renzo and Lucia is deliberately subdued. Manzoni avoids melodrama to emphasize realism. After prolonged instability, joy manifests as exhaustion, disbelief, and careful hope. Yet the vow remains, illustrating how inner constraints can outlast external threats. The resolution of the vow is important because it clarifies the novel's moral method. It does not dismiss religious commitments, but it insists on context, intention, and pastoral judgment. The point is not that vows are meaningless. It is that human beings must be guided responsibly when fear distorts choice. Finally, the marriage functions as an ethical conclusion rather than a fairy tale ending. The narrative closes by affirming that suffering leaves residues, economic, emotional, social, yet it also argues that ordinary life can be rebuilt with clearer knowledge of the world's mechanisms. The lesson, if we call it that, is not naive optimism, but disciplined hope informed by history and experience. Consider giving us a like if you learned something new. Let us know in the comments what book you would like to see next. Happy learning, we hope to see you in the next video.